To assume you are familiar with Henry VIII, the monarch known for his 6 wives and for establishing the Church of England, is a common misconception. Prepare yourself, for the actual Henry VIII was far more dreadful than any history book would have you believe. He was a king of such grotesque obesity that he required mechanical aids to assist with mobility, a man whose leg wounds, festering and decaying, emitted such a foul odor that his servants would flee in disgust. A ruler whose physical state deteriorated so severely that his coffin burst open due to the gases released from his decomposing body. You are about to uncover the astonishing truths about Henry VIII that render Game of Thrones akin to a children's story. From his peculiar dining habits to his extreme security precautions, and from his treatment of wives that extended beyond mere execution to the horrifying reality of his last days, these revelations will alter your perception of England's most notorious king. His body was a calamity in itself. Let us begin with the most startling fact about Henry VIII. By the conclusion of his life, he was essentially a living corpse. We are discussing a man whose physique had become so repulsive that even his own attendants were left traumatized. Henry's waist circumference was 54 inches. To provide context, that measurement exceeds the height of most individuals. He weighed approximately 400 pounds during a time when the average male weighed around 140. However, the truly alarming aspect was not merely his obesity. His legs were afflicted with festering open wounds that showed no signs of healing. These were not minor cuts. We are referring to large ulcers that perpetually oozed pus and decaying flesh. The odor was so intense that courtiers would press perfumed handkerchiefs to their noses when nearing the king. Some historical records indicate that the foul smell could be detected from several rooms away. Servants would actually draw straws to decide who would assist in dressing him, as getting near those wounds was regarded as a form of punishment. However, the situation worsens. Contemporary medical professionals believe that Henry endured a severe traumatic brain injury due to a jousting accident in 1536. This was not merely a minor head injury. He was unconscious for 2 hours, which in medieval times essentially meant he was nearly dead. The injury likely resulted in significant personality shifts, clarifying his evolution from a relatively normal young king to the paranoid, rage-filled figure he became in his later years. This is not information typically covered in history classes, but it is likely that Henry also suffered from a condition known as Cushing syndrome, which would account for his dramatic weight gain, mood fluctuations, and those dreadful leg ulcers that would not heal. His own physicians were so frightened of him that they would not dare to suggest he might be gravely ill, as criticizing the king's health was deemed an act of treason. The individual who asserted a divine right to govern was unable to manage his own bodily functions during his later years. Royal attendants were required to transport special chairs wherever he traveled, as Henry struggled to move from one room to another without experiencing an incident. This is the same individual who sentenced people to death for merely gazing at him inappropriately. Furthermore, the wives faced even greater hardships than one might assume. It is widely recognized that Henry VIII had 6 wives and executed 2 of them. Yet the truth of what those women suffered extends far beyond a mere beheading. We are discussing psychological torment that would evoke envy in contemporary serial killers. Consider Anne Boleyn. Prior to her execution, Henry did not simply choose to end her life. He devised a complex scheme that involved compelling her own musician to confess under duress to having an affair with her. However, the truly disturbing aspect is that Henry forced Anne to witness the execution of 5 men, including her own brother, who were accused of having relations with her. She was compelled to stand there, aware that she was next, as she observed innocent individuals perish due to her husband's delusional fears. Catherine Howard endured even greater suffering. She was essentially a teenager when Henry took her as his wife. Upon discovering her previous relationships, he did not merely execute her, he enacted a law that deemed it treasonous for anyone to marry the king without disclosing their sexual history. Imagine being so vindictive that you altered the entire legal framework because your adolescent wife was not a virgin. However, the psychological manipulation was the most distressing aspect. Henry would lavish his wives with gifts and affection one day, only to completely disregard them or issue threats the following day. Catherine of Aragon spent her last years effectively under house arrest, prohibited from seeing her daughter Mary, while Henry circulated rumors about her mental instability. She passed away in solitude, possibly due to poisoning, penning letters to Henry that he never took the time to read. Here is a shocking revelation. Henry compelled his wife to sign documents consenting to their own divorces or annulments. Anne of Cleves was so frightened of him that she consented to a fraudulent marriage annulment merely to evade execution. She essentially had to act as if their marriage had never occurred and express gratitude to him for the favor of not being killed. As for Jane Seymour, the fortunate one who succumbed to natural causes, she died from complications following the birth of Henry's son. Remarkably, Henry was already considering his next wife before Jane's body had even cooled. He waited precisely 9 days after her funeral to begin arranging his next marriage. The man treated human beings as if they were disposable items. The most tragic aspect is that these women had no means of escape. Divorce was not an option. Fleeing would result in death, and resisting would not only lead to one's own execution, but could also bring about the destruction of one's entire family. Additionally, his eating habits were utterly outrageous. If you believe that competitive eating is outrageous today, wait until you learn about the daily food intake of Henry VII. This individual did not merely dine like a monarch, he consumed food as if he were attempting to single-handedly induce a famine. Henry ingested approximately 5,000 calories each day. For perspective, this amount is more than twice the recommended intake for an active adult male. Furthermore, it is noteworthy that by the end of his life, he could hardly walk. However, the sheer volume of food was not the most peculiar aspect. It was the nature of his meals and his eating habits that stood out. A standard meal for Henry consisted of an entire roasted pig, numerous whole chickens, various types of fish, heaps of bread, and sufficient wine to buoy a small vessel. His kitchen staff prepared over 800 distinct dishes daily solely for his household, with Henry personally tasting dozens of them. The royal kitchens employed more than 200 individuals working tirelessly to satisfy his voracious appetite. Yet the most astonishing detail is that Henry believed certain foods possessed magical qualities. He was convinced that consuming swan would enhance his gracefulness. He believed that eating large quantities of deer would improve his hunting skills, and that oysters would boost his performance with his wives. Consequently, he would indulge in these particular foods in excessive amounts, resembling a medieval obsession with superfoods. Additionally, the man exhibited the most peculiar eating rituals. Every morsel of food that entered Henry's mouth was first sampled by several servants to ensure it was not poison. However, it is noteworthy that he was so paranoid that he mandated his food tasters to wait 30 minutes after their meal before he would touch anything, just to confirm they did not succumb to delayed poison effects. Henry's dining experiences were essentially theatrical displays. He would eat in front of hundreds of courtiers, and the entire process could extend up to 4 hours. Imagine sitting there, observing this enormous, decaying king slowly consume enough food to sustain a small village, all while feigning that this was entirely normal royal conduct. This is not something typically covered in history classes, but Henry actually prohibited certain foods from his court, not due to health concerns, but because he deemed them unworthy of his royal stature. Foods commonly consumed by the populace, such as turnips and barley, were outright banned from his table, despite the likelihood that they would have been healthier for him than the mountains of meat and sugar he ingested daily. The truly astonishing aspect is that, even as his body was deteriorating due to his diet, Henry continued to eat more and more, firmly believing that his royal status rendered him immune to the repercussions of his excessive indulgence. 4. The paranoia that dominated an empire. Henry VIII's paranoia was not merely a typical distrust of others. This individual transformed his entire realm into a surveillance state that would evoke envy in contemporary dictators. By the time he reached his later years, Henry was so convinced that everyone was conspiring against him that he turned royal existence into a living nightmare for all those around him. Let us begin with his sleeping arrangements. Henry slept with loaded crossbows positioned beside his bed and kept several daggers beneath his pillow. Yet that was insufficient. He also had armed guards stationed within his bedroom, vigilantly observing him as he slept throughout the night. Imagine being so fearful of assassination that you could not even close your eyes without witnesses. The palace itself morphed into a bastion of paranoia. Henry mandated the construction of secret passages throughout every structure he inhabited. Not for romantic escapades or convenience, but so he could flee if assassins came for him. He had peepholes installed in walls to spy on his own courtiers, and listening devices concealed in meeting rooms to eavesdrop on private discussions. However, this is where it becomes truly absurd. Henry established an entire network of spies whose sole purpose was to monitor his other spies. He had informants monitoring his informants, weaving a complex web of surveillance where trust was a rare commodity. Court life transformed into a psychological nightmare, where a single misstep in conversation could lead to execution. Henry's paranoia regarding food escalated to absurd extremes. He not only employed numerous food tasters, but also mandated that his meals be prepared in entirely sealed kitchens, with guards overseeing every aspect of the cooking process. The salt, spices, and even the water had to undergo testing by various individuals. His conviction that someone would poison him turned the act of eating a simple meal into a military operation. He even suspected his own children of conspiring against him. He had spies monitoring Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth, his daughters convinced they were plotting his downfall. These were mere children, yet he treated them as if they were enemy agents within their own home. Henry's paranoia escalated to such an extent that he began executing individuals for crimes they had not yet committed. He would order someone's death based on a dream of betrayal or a suggestion of potential disloyalty from another. The Tower of London was perpetually filled with individuals whose only offense was being in proximity to Henry during one of his paranoid episodes. The truly frightening aspect was that Henry's paranoia was so infectious that it spread throughout his entire court. Nobles began spying on one another, servants betrayed their masters for non-existent rewards, and everyone lived in constant dread of becoming the next target of the king's irrational suspicions. Even death could not quell the turmoil. One might assume that Henry VII's reign of terror would conclude with his demise, but that was not the case. This man was so dedicated to chaos that even in death, his corpse continued to wreak havoc. Let us begin with the final weeks of Henry. He had grown so enormous that he was unable to walk. Consequently, his servants were required to transport him everywhere, in a specially crafted chair equipped with pulleys and wheels. However, the most repulsive aspect was that his leg wounds had become severely infected, causing pieces of decaying flesh to literally detach from his body as he was moved. Servants had to trail behind him with cloths to clean up the remnants of the decomposing king that fell onto the palace floors. His death scene resembled a scene from a horror film.